I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, we have Judge Ellis giving Paul Manafort 47 months in prison. A highly controversial judgment, especially for the left that was hoping, to see him in prison according to what Mueller wanted. I think he wanted 20 years plus, and the left was kind of pulling for that. It also was a little bit of a signal as to maybe what to expect from the Mueller investigation, which, we keep on waiting for that report, week after week. What do you make of Ellis's judgment on Manafort?
Well, I think that Ellis was right, and I'm going to explain why. What Ellis has been saying, and he was the trial judge in the case, and he's been saying this repeatedly in various interventions throughout the case, is that as far as he was concerned, putting aside the question of whether Manafort was innocent or guilty of the charges that had been brought against him, the real reason he was being prosecuted was because Mueller was trying to get to Trump through Manafort. In other words, it was a politically motivated prosecution brought in bad faith. Ellis didn't like that. He wasn't prepared to throw the whole case out, because clearly there was a case to answer by Manafort. But it was a case that Manafort had been investigated for previously, which he had been told by the FBI and the Justice Department he wouldn't be prosecuted for, and which Mueller dusted off in order to get at him as a way of getting at Trump. Ellis didn't like that, and though he in the end found against Manafort, or rather the jury found against Manafort, and Ellis refused to dismiss the case, he's made very, very clear by this sentence what he thinks of the whole case that was brought against Manafort, and has clearly signaled that he doesn't agree with it and he thinks that it was wrong.
Alexander, one thing that I'm having a hard time understanding is why would Mueller press for such a strict sentence on Manafort, 20 plus years? Mueller knows that Manafort had nothing to do with Trump-Russia collusion. Ellis stated it specifically. He was adamant to make it a point. Manafort had nothing to do with Russia or this Trump-Russia collusion. So he made it a point. He stressed that. Why was Mueller going for this type of sentence when he also knows the facts behind this entire case?
I think there are two reasons. One, and I'm going to be very, very straight here, I think it's pure petulance. I think that Mueller saw Manafort as the key to proving Trump-Russia collusion. Manafort is the key player in the Trump dossier that Christopher Steele put together. He plays the leading role in it. He's also been the person who was accused during the 2016 presidential election of being Trump's, evil genius, who was brought in to basically build up this relationship with Russia. This is all based on a misinterpretation of Manafort's role in Ukraine, where he had previously been advising Yanukovych. And we've discussed on previous programs the story that Manafort was acting for the Russians when he was advising Manafort could not be more wrong. The reality was he was actually acting for the US against the Russians when he was in Ukraine and advising Yanukovych. But never mind. Anyway, Manafort has always been the leading person that people thought was behind this collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia that Mueller was supposed to be investigating. And I think Mueller was extremely angry that he found this person who he expected to turn out to be the star witness for the collusion case that he was trying to construct. I think he was very angry that Manafort didn't come up with the goods and didn't play up to it. And in fact, it was impossible to prove collusion through Manafort. So I think partly it was anger that drove him to demand this big sentence.
He wanted to punish him in a way?
He wanted to punish him, exactly. He wanted to punish him. But I think there was also another thing, which is a public relations aspect to all of this, which is that Mueller has not really come up with anything of any substance in the 2 years that he has been investigating this case. All the other indictments that he has brought have either been against Russians, which he cannot try because those people will not come to the United States for trial, and he knows it. And that's partly the reason why he brought those indictments, because he doesn't have to prove them. Or they have been against minor bit players in the collusion saga, against whom he has managed to convict of minor process crimes. So it hasn't looked really very impressive. I think he was hoping that if he convicted Manafort of 24 plus years or whatever it was that he was asking for, he was hoping that he would be able to spin it as a sign that he has actually uncovered a serious crime and exposed a serious criminal, thereby justifying in some way all this vast machinery of investigation that he has brought into play. And at the same time, by getting that big conviction and that big sentence, sort of given the impression to people that there was more to this Russia-Trump collusion narrative than there actually was. Well, it has backfired badly on him because Judge Ellis has made very clear that he's not playing to that gallery at all.
All right, that makes a lot of sense, because throughout this entire 2 years, it seems that Manafort has been the one person that, the mainstream media, Mueller, the Democrats, they've thrown so much disinformation onto the shoulders of Manafort. I'm not saying Manafort's a good guy or a bad guy, or that he didn't commit financial crimes or money laundering, whatever it is, tax evasion, call it whatever you want. But they've thrown so many lies onto the shoulders of Manafort, from the fact that he was in Ukraine and he was working with Russia, trying to pull Ukraine and Yanukovych into the Russian sphere, which you've debunked countless times. That's just factually incorrect. To the recent lie that he was giving secret polling data to the Russians, which you've debunked many, many times. The polling data wasn't secret, and he was giving it to Ukrainians. So it seems that maybe Mueller was trying to once again throw such a harsh sentence onto the shoulders of Manafort that once again more lies would kind of be created out of this 24-year sentence. And Ellis burst his bubble there.
Exactly. That's exactly what I think. And you missed what I think is the most bizarre and ridiculous lie of all, which is that Manafort was having secret meetings with Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy, which everybody has tremendous observations about. I mean, Manafort has been, let's be very clear about this. I have no doubt that Manafort is guilty of the financial crimes that he has been accused of. As was Podesta. There's been many other people.
I mean, the same thing.
Lots of people in Washington are guilty of these crimes. Certainly not Manafort alone. And there we come. And that's actually a very important point, because he was singled out for prosecution, not because of the crimes he had committed, but because of his proximity to Donald Trump, and because of certain people wanted to get him to crack, to implicate Trump in this collusion story, which has no substance to it. That never happened. So he may be, but that was not why he was prosecuted. And as I said, there's this combination of anger against him and the desire to continue to construct this, as you absolutely rightly said, this utterly false narrative around him, which makes him out into this much more sinister individual than he really is.
Why did Christopher Steele single out Manafort in his phony dossier? Because when you go back to the genesis of all of this, you could probably start at the dossier, and you mentioned it, that Manafort was a central player in all of that. Why did Steele wrap him up in this?
Right.
Or was this just bad luck for Manafort?
Right.
I mean,
it wasn't just bad luck, but I mean, I should say that it was one of the things which, when I first read the dossier, and I read it on the day that BuzzFeed published it, it was one of the things that made me feel right from the get-go that this dossier was wrong and that it was just didn't make any kind of sense. Because, of course, what Steele was doing, or maybe not Steele himself, but the sources that Steele was relying on, they were basing their story that Manafort was this big conduit between the Trump campaign and the Russians. He was the sort of link man upon the news media story that Manafort was close to the Russians when he was in Ukraine and had been working for the Russians when he was in Ukraine. Now, I have studied the Ukrainian situation in great detail, and I already knew at that point that the truth was the actual opposite, that instead of Manafort working for the Russians in Ukraine, he had been working against them. So that told me right from the start that this dossier just didn't make sense and couldn't be true. But it was that Ukrainian connection that I have no doubt at all that was the reason why those people who concocted the dossier singled him out, because they were trying to mislead people into thinking that this Ukrainian connection somehow meant a Russian connection. And you mentioned this business about the polling data and Manafort sharing polling data with Russians when he was actually sharing it with Ukrainians. And so you see how this attempt to conflate Russians and Ukrainians still continues to this day.
My final question, and this is a big one, and I've just thought of this right now as you were talking, and I'd like your insight on it. Manafort, you knew from the minute you read the dossier that it was false, because you studied the situation in Ukraine in great detail, and you knew that Manafort was working to get Yanukovych to move towards the European Union and towards the West. And you can explain the situation very briefly to our viewers. It was, many years ago when all of this was breaking with the Maidan and Yanukovych's decision to either, go with the European Union or continue relations with Russia, etc. So you can get into that a little bit as well as to Manafort's position. But why do you think that throughout these last 2 years, the Trump White House, Fox News, other forces, Steve Bannon, other forces aligned with Trump, his legal team, Giuliani, Secular, all these guys they know this as well. They know this. There's no doubt they know this, that Manafort, whose side Manafort was on. How come they haven't pushed this narrative? Is it because, and this is just a theory, is it because they're told not to push this narrative because that would debunk much of the geopolitical story we've been told about what happened at the Maidan and Ukraine?
Right. First of all, can I just make it absolutely clear that my account is the correct one, that Manafort was working for the United States in Ukraine. Not only did I know that when I saw the dossier published, but it was essentially confirmed during Manafort's trial. There is no dispute about this, no available dispute about this. Now, can I just say what was going on in Ukraine before the Maidan coup? You had a person who was Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president of Ukraine, who came from a Russian-speaking region, which was Donetsk, but who was trying to play the Europeans and the Americans on the one hand and the Russians off against each other. So he had some pro-Russian advisors within his government, and he had some pro-American advisors also. And of course, he also brought in Manafort, who was this person that he was using to open up a kind of back channel to the United States. And in fact, Manafort, as we know, was working very closely with the US Embassy during that period. Now, what actually happened was that the Podestas and all these people, exactly. Now, what actually happened was that Yanukovych, his attempt to play the Americans and the Europeans off against the Russians, what it ended up doing was that he created a tug of war between the Russians on the one hand and the Western powers on the other in the Ukraine. And that eventually worked against Yanukovych because, of course, he lost the confidence of both sides. And in 2014, the Western powers, utterly exasperated with him and infuriated by the fact that he'd gone against Manafort's advice and had scrapped an association agreement, which he'd concluded with the EU. Anyway, angered with him, they moved to back his political opponents inside Ukraine, and the result was the Maidan coup. But that was the background. That was what happened.
He went against Manafort's advice.
He went against Manafort's advice, exactly. Now, why are they not? Why are all these important people not mentioning Manafort's actual role? Why is it not appearing in the media? I think there are two reasons for this. Firstly, obviously, the Democrats and the media, the very last thing they want to do is to admit that Manafort, whilst he was in Ukraine, was working against the Russians and with the US embassy and for the United States, because that would undermine the entire Russiagate narrative, of which he is a linchpin. But as you absolutely correctly say, the reason that the Trump administration and all these other people are not saying that, either you absolutely spot on right, is because admitting the truth about what Manafort was doing in Ukraine would highlight what the Western powers were doing in Ukraine,
Bingo.
which would undermine the entire narrative of the Maidan coup, and which would, of course, undermine the whole geopolitical play that the United States is playing in Ukraine. So I think on that point, you are absolutely spot on right.
So Manafort is not only the linchpin in the entire Russia collusion hoax, he's also the linchpin in a way for the entire Ukraine regime change coup started by the Obama administration.
Absolutely. I mean, if you go back into it, you drill into what happened and look at the events of in Ukraine. Manafort was a key player. There's no question about this. He was also very, frankly, a player who, in this very corrupt country, made absolutely sure that he got all sorts of nice payoffs. So he was working to some extent in his own interests. But overall, he was working on behalf of the United States. No question about this. And he played an absolutely central role in creating the circumstances that led to the Maidan coup in February 2014 and to the crisis in Ukraine, which continues to this day.
And with one tweet, Trump could blow up the entire narrative, not only for Manafort, but for Ukraine as well. And the deep state, the U.S. government, the State Department, the Defense Department would never allow that.
No, well, exactly. That's the whole point. I mean, they don't want the story coming out because they don't want to admit that the Maidan coup was a coup, and they don't want to admit that this was the Western role in it. I mean, the orthodox, the conventional language, the official line is that it was an internal revolution. President Poroshenko of Ukraine calls it a revolution of dignity. But in reality, it was a Western-sponsored regime change operation with Manafort heavily implicated in it.
All right. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. Remember to visit the Duran shop, buy a t-shirt, help support us. And in the description box down below, you'll find links to our PayPal and Patreon pages. Please donate to us as well. That really helps us out a lot. You can also get this video in audio format. Follow us on iTunes and on SoundCloud. Go to theduran.com and see all the articles that Alexander links up to every day. Alexander Mercouris, fascinating discussion. Until next time, everybody, take care.